Hi, Legal Research. This is it. This is the day that you get to submit your brief memo. And I'm excited because all of the semester has got us to this point, and I'm excited for you to finally have it off of your shoulders, because I'm sure it's a bit of a weight that will be lifted by the time you submit it at the end of your class this week. So this video lecture is just to give you some final tips that you should be paying attention to as you prepare your final submission. All right. First of all, the PowerPoint reminds you of the overall memo formatting that is expected. Once again, I would refer you to Appendix 14.1 in your textbook. That appendix I've referenced numerous times in class since the first week that we've discussed our memo back right after reading week. So just be mindful of the format of that memo, because your format should look exactly the same way. In addition, there are PowerPoint slides from earlier on in the semester when we first started talking about the memo that remind you what the format should look like. So I'd refer you to those as well. At the top of the page, though, you should have a to, a from, a date, and a re. The re line is what is this file about. So you could easily just put the parties' names in there, okay? You're going to have a facts section, an issue section, a law section, broken down between statute and case law in that order. You're going to do your analysis and then your conclusion piece. And that will be the format of your memo. Don't forget about the McGill requirements that are attached to this assignment. I'm hoping that by the time you complete this assignment, you are finally feeling excited and certain of your McGill abilities, right? We've talked about these since September now, but of course there's been more of a focus on it in recent weeks in this course. So the PowerPoint slides will take you through a McGill bibliography checklist. You've already received feedback from me if you completed Workshop 3, which was a submission of your bibliography. And so I've given you some feedback on DC Connect about that already. So it looks good, looks bad, looks okay, but you need to do this, 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 this. And for the most part, you guys are really, I guess, on board with bibliography submission, and you did very well in that workshop. So some things to remind you about in your bibliography. The word bibliography does not actually appear at the top of the page. I didn't tell you that in the workshop last week, but some of you submitted it that way, and so I realized then, oh, I need to tell them that. On the slide that shows what an example bibliography looks like, you'll see it doesn't actually show that at the top of the page. So the term bibliography doesn't actually show up there. The bibliography, however, should start at the top of a page. So you're not going to start it midway through a page where your memo ends. You're going to wait and go to the next page to start your bibliography. Items are sorted by section and type of resource. So you're going to have your legislation section, your jurisprudence section, and your secondary material section. Right? All in that order. All of those headings appear in caps, but they are not bolded, underlined, or made in a larger font size. What else do you need to know? If you are having, if you have a source that moves on to a second line, the second line of that source needs to be indented. You'll see that on the example on the PowerPoint slide from last week and from this week, okay? If you're not sure what I'm talking about there. It's called a hanging indent. So be sure of that. The items that would go in the legislation section are statutes as well as regulations, which is considered secondary legislation or subordinate legislation, and or rules. You don't have any rules that apply in this memo scenario, but if you did, well, you do. Sorry, I was thinking in my head tribunal rules. You do have rules. So I'll just erase that last line. You don't have any tribunal rules, but you certainly have a piece of secondary legislation there that goes by the name rules, right? So you would want that in there. McGill 9th edition, all requirements in McGill 9th edition, so just be mindful of that. Refer to the handbook if you need to. I posted that under last week's resources. If you don't have the full McGill guide at your fingertips, you should be referring to that to make sure that your bibliography is formatted accordingly and your citations are formatted accordingly. So we don't want to see any periods in the citation line at all, except at the very end. All the periods in the middle should be removed, okay? Legislation titles are italicized, but nothing else is italicized, just the title. Be mindful of the difference between how Citations look for revised editions versus annual statutes. For revised editions, they have both a chapter and a letter code. And for annual statutes, they have a number only, right? So just be mindful of that, making sure your citation looks accordingly. If there is more than one piece of legislation, they should be listed alphabetically. In the bibliography, when you're listing your legislation, you actually do not include the pinpoint references that you've referred to earlier on in your memo. You would refer to those in your footnotes appropriately, but once it comes to the bibliography, you're only citing the main source. You do not put the specific sections of a statute or those pinpoint references there. In the jurisprudence category, you're going to make sure that your case names or decision names are italicized, but that nothing else is. Again, if there are more than one, you're going to alphabetize those. And you're going to make sure your citations are formatted correctly. In the secondary sources, you're going to have the author's last name first, and then the first name second, okay? In your footnote, you would have it turned around the other way, flipped. So you'd have author first name, last name. In the bibliography, you're going to have author last name, first name. And then just pay attention to some of the other rules that apply. If there are multiple authors, you only list the first author. Author names are followed by a period. Okay, so just be mindful of all of that, and you can look to the McGill handbook for that. For books, and for those of you who are including a secondary source, and I know some of you are, because it's in your bibliographies, the title of the book is italicized. The edition is noted, so if it's 4th edition, you would see that in there. And then in brackets, you're going to have the place that it was published, colon, the publisher, and then the year. So pay attention to format. And then a period would follow at the very end of that citation. If there's more than one item listed, of course, those are going to be in alphabetical order as well. And then finally, I would just remind you to do a final proofread. This is the piece where students get to, and they're just so exhausted with the assignment and the memo that they can't possibly read it over again. And so if you're at that place, ask someone else to read it. There's probably a lot of people, a lot of friends and family that are sitting at home right now, that if you shoot them at the memo via email, they might be actually looking forward to some interesting reading on the side. So you might actually be a bright light in their day by asking them to review your brief memo for you. So you'll be doing an act of goodwill at the same time ensuring that you edited it correctly. All right, so I highly recommend that. Spelling and grammar checks are really, really important. I remind you of all the SALS modules that are available online now, even in case you're struggling with some editorial issues or grammar issues or sentence structure. Be consistent with the font throughout. So make sure your font is the same. Nothing is worse than receiving a document with different fonts in it accidentally. Sometimes a different font is used for different headings, and that's for effect. But in academic work, that should never be the case. So your fonts should always match up. So please make sure your fonts match up and that your margins are appropriate and all of that, okay? Partners and groups, it is expected that all of you are taking the time to review the memo for all of these final checklist points and tips. Because if you leave the burden on one, that's just not okay. It's not fair necessarily to that student. But also you're each responsible for catching those errors and omissions. So if there is an error and it impacts your grade, you're all responsible for that. You all share the same grade. You have to have citations. Citations are integral to your mark. So be mindful of that. And then the last thing I have to tell you, I thought this video was going to be under 10 minutes and it pretty much is. So woohoo for you. The last thing I wanted to remind you of are your deadlines. So you're going to be submitting your memo this week by the end of class time. So on Monday section, that's by 12 p.m. noon. On Tuesday section, that's at 2 p.m. On Thursday section, that's at 4 p.m. And you're going to submit those to the assignment folder in DC Connect. I am excited to get them and read them. And then you can break your minds for a bit. Next week's legal research class will be basically an online test of the test, if that makes sense. I'll offer you some questions that you should expect on the final test that follows the week after. All right? Save your questions up, and if you have them, bring them to the class discussion. And I was wrong. I've just gone over 10 minutes, so I'm so sorry to eat into that extra 15, 20 seconds of your time. Have a great week. We'll talk